Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, Sona and I will be discussing the fourth episode of the Showtime original series, The Agency. Also Paramount Plus. I don't know how this is branded, Paramount Plus / Showtime. Before that, just some show notes. Early in the upcoming week, Darren and I will be discussing the final episode of the Day of the Jackal series, which just wrapped up overseas just yesterday, and will be premiering here in the US on Peacock on Thursday, but expect that episode ahead of time. And now with that show wrapped up, finally going to start to republish Sona and I's conversation about Severance Season 1 in anticipation of Severance Season 2. The full Season 2 trailer has just dropped this week, a thrilling trailer, and do expect to hear me break down that trailer in greater detail, probably in that first episode. I've also already recorded a conversation with my sister, Celia, regarding her rewatch of the first season, and Darren and I will also be discussing the first season at some point in the future. So during the holidays, when I probably won't be recording much new content, do expect to hear those episodes republished in anticipation of Season 2, coming January 17. Sona and I will continue to cover The Agency week to week through the end of its run, which is January 24th. So a couple of weeks of overlap there between Severance and The Agency. Also, probably on New Year's Day, or right around that time, I'll be publishing 1 or 2 episodes recapping some of the events of the year in television and in movies. If there's anything you saw this year on TV or in cinemas that you want to shout out that you think that maybe is getting overlooked, let us know. Either email us at needssomeintroduction@gmail.com, or better yet, if you'd like to be part of the show, attach a voice memo to an email. Just record it on your phone and send it to needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. And I'll include it in one of those end-of-year episodes. Of course, we are just entering award season, and I will definitely be giving my opinion on some of the awards that have been coming out. I will also be watching some of these films that are coming late in the year. Nosferatu's coming out on Christmas Day, as is Baby Girl, 2 films I'm very much looking forward to. And one of the most acclaimed films of the year, The Brutalist, is not even available anywhere, but is already all over the top 10 lists because critics have had a chance to see it. So definitely something I plan to see, but who knows, it probably won't be until mid-January, so my best of list is probably incomplete, to say the least, but time to start doing some of that list grooming. And I'll definitely be catching up on some of my blind spots over the course of my extended holiday break. Speaking of filling in some blind spots, just some things you may have put a pin in and were unaware that you can catch up on now on streaming, things that we've discussed here on the podcast before. First of all, if you've been waiting to see Alien Romulus, it is now available to stream on Disney and or Hulu. And of course, one of our most popular episodes this summer was my review of that film along with a Alien series retrospective, which featured reviews of all those films. And of course, all of that is legwork for the upcoming Noah Hawley Alien Earth TV series, which has been teased multiple times now in the FX and Hulu promos for next year. Also, just last week, Beetlejuice became available to stream on Max, and it is quite a busy end-of-year movie release schedule for Max. There's Beetlejuice, as I mentioned, and of course, here in the podcast feed, a retrospective of Tim Burton's career with that review of Beetlejuice. And this very upcoming weekend, actually today, this very day that I'm recording this, Joker Folie à Deux has premiered on HBO Max. So obviously the vast majority of people who saw the first Joker film, which made $1.1 billion, astonishing number, and only $200 million worth of ticket sales, internationally that is, for Joker Folie à Deux. It is, just to be clear, this episode that I did on the podcast of Joker Folie à Deux, not only is this film not done well in movie theaters, it has almost within 2 weeks or so became available as a digital rental. And no one appeared to do that either, because that is the lowest downloads I've had for any episode in this podcast, was my retrospective of the Joker 1 and the review of Joker 2. It was the worst download numbers I've had on an episode of the podcast since before we covered Severance all the way back 3 years ago. So the podcast has grown a lot since then, and yet the numbers were absolutely horrible. So nobody saw this movie, which is shocking. But if you are going to watch this weekend, I do recommend you watch it. It is quite a conversation piece. I still would like to have a conversation with somebody, one of the co-hosts, about this film, because it is a very interesting disaster of a kind and courageous, because it's very much intentionally the bad film it chooses to be. And that is kind of interesting, if that makes any sense. Anyway, you can decide for yourself if you've heard all the pros and cons about it, mostly cons, a film that was rejected thoroughly by both critics and fans. But if you're curious to check it out, available now on Max. So don't have to pay anything if you have Max. And it's definitely worth a look. I don't like it, but it's definitely interesting. And as I mentioned, pretty busy release schedule for Max. We have next week, next Saturday or Friday, whatever these premiere dates are, Juror number 2, what is almost certainly going to be Clint Eastwood's final film as a director, and almost certainly as an actor, I would presume. He is now 96, 93, 94. I just looked it up. And this is a really good film, a very interesting film. I won't do a full review here, but maybe I will do a Clint Eastwood career retrospective, which is massive, much more massive than any retrospective I've done here on the podcast before. Maybe I'll focus just on the ones he's directed. But I highly recommend people watch this when it premieres on Max next week. It has its flaws, but it's very interesting, especially when you consider that this is Eastwood. This is his closing statement, and it is a very quiet film by his standards. At some points in the film, it very much feels like 12 Angry Men. It's very much a juror procedural, that type of film. But it has thriller elements as well, and a truly great ending. You will think about the ending of this film for quite some time after you watch it. Okay, so those are some things that you might want to catch up on, especially on if you have Max. Oh, and I'll throw in there on Peacock, by the way, just premiered in the past 2 weeks. First of all, a really interesting thriller that I reviewed here on the podcast, Speak No Evil, an adaptation of a truly cruel viewing experience, the original, but transformed into something more populist and more entertaining, but equally successful in this American remake. Something I was very skeptical of, so check out my review episode in the backlog if you are catching up on that film recently. And also on Peacock, of course, any of you who have been watching The Day of the Jackal can watch this on Peacock as well. The premiere of Conclave, a very interesting mystery thriller that just premiered in theaters and did surprisingly well for the type of film that it is, will almost certainly be nominated for Best Picture this year. Ralph Fiennes will absolutely be nominated for Best Actor and perhaps win as a career retrospective. So check that out. All these things recently, many premieres here late in the year, probably to capitalize on people's time off during the holidays. Okay, before we get into the conversation, Sona and I breaking down The Agency, this 4th episode called Quarterback Blitz, let me walk through the plot a little bit with you before we bring Sona in on a conversation. As the episode kicks off, we see Martian, the Michael Fassbender character, which has yet another alias this episode. So let's just call him Martian. Right where we left him at the end of last episode, this is the aftermath of something terrible happening that we are not certain of yet. He's being questioned. He's on a gurney, has bruising under one of his eyes, and apparently telling the story of this cataclysm and how his relationship with Samia led to most of this. I assume this will be the framing device for at least the most of the remainder of the season. We're introduced to something immediately that I assume Martian is not aware of, that Samia is actually in London to negotiate or to help negotiate some dealings between the Sudanese and Chinese officials. So as we suspected, she definitely is here under cover of being at this university conference, but is actually there facilitating this negotiation. And this agent that we saw at the end of last week's episode, tracking her on the bridge, whose name is Osman, is not actually there tracking her movement because of her husband, which is one of the things that we speculated on, Sona and I, last week. Osman is actually an agent for Mukhabarat, which is the intelligence agency of the Sudan. And it's pretty clear over the course of the episode that he's primarily concerned with Sami being compromised as part of this negotiation. Now, some interesting historical context, current historical context that I was really not that familiar with, to be honest. But there has been this ongoing Sudanese civil war, and there are multiple large national interests that are all vested in the outcome of this civil war, or maybe more opportunistically hoping that the unrest there gives them an opportunity in this country that's considered a triple threat, called a triple threat country, in that they have oil, they have gold, and they have access to the Red Sea, and therefore the Suez Canal. So all the big players in this region were interested. The Russians, of course, the Saudis, of course, the US and UK collaboratively here, of course. And now the Chinese are meeting in secret. And who's there? Surprise, surprise, Samia is there as a subject matter expert. And Samia's involvement in this negotiation is going to be important to many things that happen in the course of this episode. Next, we see Martian meet with Henry in his office. There's a mouse there. Interesting factoid here, which is true. that most of the mice here in the US came from England, probably during the migration of the Pilgrims back hundreds of years ago. This is a mouse, though, I think, not a rat, but I guess one thing, rodents in general, lead Henry to make this observation. They bring up the Felix thing again. It's so strange that no one's given us details on what the Felix operation is. I guess Henry knows enough to know that he shouldn't know and that his brother-in-law is involved, but those details are still vague. Meanwhile, apparently there's some minor international incident where a U.S. senator has called Belarus a failed state and a puppet for the Putin regime. So there are some Belarus representatives there to have a conversation. Bosco's involved. Henry and Martian are en route. They want to use this as an opportunity to open up a back channel to Belarus that they want their agent back and they're willing to pay for it in some way. Is that money? Is that quid pro quo information sharing? Not clear at this point. This is a very funny sequence where they run down to the meeting, Henry and Martian and Owen. Bosco says they can come in as long as they keep their mouths shut. Immediately, Henry starts to correct one of the Belarusians that the senator was not from Idaho, but from Iowa, or vice versa, I can't remember. And Martian jumps in on this as well. This is a football move that they have coordinated, not a quarterback blitz, by the way, where Henry is intentionally digressing the conversation in some way that could be antagonistic, and Martian is checking out the responses from each one of these folks to see which one of them is there with a different agenda. And they've told Bosco that they'll be able to figure it out. By the way, MVP here in this scene for Richard Gere, who's doing a great job on the show, by the way, for being absolutely stunned by Henry immediately opening his mouth after he told him to keep completely quiet and just observe, is just a great bit of acting here. Martian makes eyes with this older Belarusian who's there, and I couldn't get a read from this scene whether he's just making eyes at him or if they are indeed negotiating something. And Martian takes this opportunity to just run into him in the lobby. He speaks Russian, understands what they're talking about. Some wild club in town, and Martian's like, sure, I can take you there. And then very happy to see this happening. I very much liked episode 3, but the one thing that was missing was catching up with Daniela, this junior agent, and how she's progressing on her mission here to infiltrate this Iranian asset, or at least cozy up to him. We see Naomi, played by Catherine Waterston, is coaching Danny, played by Sora Lightfoot-Leone. And as she's entering this university building, I thought it was interesting, this analysis that there are 3 types of enemies here. Your rivals, of course. In the context of the show, she's going to have to be the best candidate. But all of these other students are also jockeying for that position. Her second is her friends, because then if she befriends these people, starts putting their needs ahead of her own, and even the distraction of maintaining these relationships could potentially lose her this opportunity. And the third type of enemy is the predator. Now, there are a few ways you can read this idea of a predator. Very interesting that we see Reza, the professor, as that very predator here in this representation, because we do see that he has predatory predilections later in the very episode. And yet she needs to cozy up to him. He's the one who will be making the decision, and he's also the predator. So I definitely am going to dig into this when I talk to Sona. I'm certain we've all had these types of experiences at work where, as expressed here, even your friends sometimes can be a liability to your success at your task at hand. And then there are people who are trying to sabotage you because of their own career goals. And of course, the predatory people who, it doesn't always have to be a sexually predatory character. It may simply be someone who wants to scapegoat you for their own failings or give you work to do because they have some kind of power over you. But I couldn't help but wonder if this is the calculus that women have to make all the time in the workplace. And I'm very curious to see what Sona says about that possible metaphor. And in her interactions, we see examples of all of this. Primarily this one character who's showing her the ropes and introducing her to everybody at the facility. And there's this young man who apparently is always at Reza's side, and they're always playing squash together, even when he only has 45 minutes. I have 45 minutes between meetings or classes. And he's like, hey, well, why don't we go play squash again? Like proving the point that he's trying to monopolize his time as much as possible. We also get some additional details here as to why this seismology program is so apropos a cover here. Iran has become extremely adept at even predicting earthquakes because we've seen the news, some very large earthquakes in this Middle Eastern region. So some additional context there around all of this. And we spend even more time with Danny later. Once again, definitely the character I'm probably hoping to see more of here throughout the course of this season of television. We briefly see Osman also confronting Samia about her relationship, this person that she was fighting with after leaving the movie theater, and this is going to boil over later in the episode. Poppy goes to visit Martian, and once again, I very much like seeing these scenes, all of them so far, between Fassbender and this actress playing Poppy. He apologizes for his behavior. She does crack him up by asking for drugs when he asks if she needs anything else. He says, hey, I've only been a father as long as you've been my daughter. But of course, he's been absent most of that time as well. They bond over the fact they're both in therapy, and she offers to forgive him all his transgressions with some shopping therapy. Martian notices that someone is following him, at least one person, but he decides to test his theory out. It's Osman, by the way. And they duck into a pastry shop or something, and he sees Osman sprinting by. I believe he assumes this is just his tail, his replacement for Grandpa and Grandma, which we don't see at all this episode, a CIA agent. But of course, being able to shake Osman so easily makes him extremely suspicious of this supposed English teacher. Next, we're back in the interrogation room with Dr. Blake. Another great scene. All the scenes here between the two of these actors have been terrific. A couple of very interesting things happen here. Dr. Blake does prove that she is open to having an honest conversation with Martian, unless this is all part of a manipulation as well. She admits that she has not had sex in quite some time when Martian turns the question back on her, and then lies straight to her face that he's not been with Samia and since he was back in Ethiopia. He admits that he was in love with her, but says that he has buried those emotions deep in the ground, which of course we know is a lie. And most interestingly, when she asks him, how did you get that scar on your hand? He has a pretty large cut on his hand, which is healed up. And he says it was an avocado pit. I've never cut my hand pitting an avocado this way. So again, we see him lie. There's also an interesting piece of dialogue here where Blake says that wounds heal and they become stories that we tell ourselves. So once again, this idea of identity when we are making up the stories we tell ourselves. No one can trust us, but can we even trust ourselves? And of course, this is all setting up whatever this framing story is, where Martian is now injured from some kind of fight or terrorist attack. Seems to be more large scale than that, although we have very little context so far. Back to Danny again. She's giving a presentation. She seems very knowledgeable on her field of interest. All of this, of course, is scripted for her. And she's impressed Reza enough that he wants to bring her to a presentation that night in front of all of the experts in this field for her to give this opening statement. She has no idea what this topic is. And Naomi is meeting her in her apartment, telling her that she needs to memorize a 25-page thesis, basically, on the topic within the next hour when Reza is coming to pick her up. She's trying to memorize this. Her battery dies on her phone. Look, if you're going to be a spy, A, your phone has got to be charged at all times. Second of all, backup battery, people. Bring a backup battery at all times. And then Reza shows up. She's really flummoxed by this because her batteries died just minutes before he arrived. Not for nothing, but 2 or 3 more minutes of cramming was not going to be enough. And then, of course, the predator emerges. He touches her hair. He touches her thigh. This is a very interesting scene. She tries to change the dynamic by appealing to his paternal instinct, saying, well, this isn't going to work sexually because you remind me of my dad. And he does seem to soften a little bit here, but he's also frustrated by this not going the way he intended. And he decides to drop her off. He's like, it's okay. I'll get someone else to do the opening statements. She's like, oh, I'm not going at all? He's like, no. But then when she gets out of the car, she has a smirk on her face. She thinks this is somehow not a liability, which I'm curious about because I think this is going to hurt her odds. Although if Reza conquered her, maybe that's not a good thing either, because then maybe he wouldn't want to bring her around as a liability in the most crass way possible, has gotten what he wants. So therefore, maybe he wouldn't bring her along. She doesn't have to do the presentation she wasn't prepared for, so that's a plus. But I do wonder if she has a broader plan here or some additional manipulation, or if this has opened some door that she sees here. I can't quite figure it out. The night finally arrives, and we're at this club called The Chamber, I believe, that Fassbender's character has brought this Belarusian agent to. It's some kind of fetish club, which apparently is his thing, or at least it's a curiosity to him. And this is finally where Martian makes his approach, saying that last time I was around this neighborhood, someone stole my bike. And you know what? I would pay almost anything to get that bike back, way more than you would assume the value of that bike would be. And of course, this is him just fishing here for the possibility that Coyote, the agent that disappeared in the episode number 1, his return might be open for negotiation. He leaves him his number. He has a burner phone. Apparently, there's a lot of burner phones out there with different numbers attached to them or different assets attached to them. Bosco and Henry are there talking about hobbies and how they should have them. when Martian shows up. And we see him Martian leave this burner phone behind in this case. I guess there's always agents watching these phones, and each one of these burners with a different phone number attached to them is probably raises an alarm to the appropriate audience. This is a very analog yet probably effective mechanism to do this. Another little tidbit that comes out of here, which I found interesting, is that the congressman that almost started this international incident was actually manipulated by the CIA. It turns out his son had turned up at an airport with cocaine in his bag. So these are all manipulations within manipulations. And as we get to the end of the episode, we see Danny has called up her mother in Spain, reminiscing about her dad. It's an emotional conversation, so we don't have many details, but it appears that some aspects of the story she told in the car with Reza were true. So these are people who are using their true biographies, their true emotions, as a form of manipulation. And I mentioned this when we were covering the Day of the Jackal series as well, but there's definitely a metaphor here between an agent and an actor because there is all this performance. Back in his apartment, Martian is looking at his ID, the one for the Paul Lewis character, which of course only exists at this point to maintain this relationship with Samia. We see a flashback to where he actually got the cut on his hand while he was aggressively washing his dishes. And you see that Samia was leading some kind of protest against the military junta in this area of Ethiopia, I presume. And when the military shows up, she needs to take cover. I assume this isn't when they met. I assume they were already involved for him to risk his life like this. Some beautiful photography here, by the way. There's this incredible shot, overhead shot, probably a drone shot, where the two of them are crossing this rooftop. And they're just these tiny specks on this giant expanse, like really beautifully done. I probably haven't called out that even with Joe Wright gone from the show, there is still a beautiful aesthetic to this show. Maybe not as stylized as those first two episodes, but definitely still working from his template. Maybe even a little better. It's probably a little less fussy. I do like Joe Wright in general. Very memorable visuals in all of his films, but they are a little showy. You definitely kind of stop and look at what he's doing. This is a little less fussy in general, but still working really well. And like I said, still beautiful framing and beautiful moody lighting. And I love the way that the darkness of this office, oftentimes when they're in it, when it's mostly vacant. And I like when it's brightly lit and there's so much light coming in. It's like this very inviting and seemingly open place. But then, of course, often shot at night. It's a much more oppressive mood that is set for sure. And he ends up killing one of these military police, people who've been pursuing Samia. And we see the body in the hallway. She doesn't notice it as he directs her the other way. But this is all part of the cover he was maintaining. And of course, triggered by that memory, triggered by the scar on his hand, Dr. Blake bringing it up, but mostly, I think, brought up by the fact that earlier in the episode, he had gotten research back on Samia, and he was looking for anything suspicious, any gaps in her history, anytime she disappeared suspiciously. The agent who's been doing this investigation says, we don't see anything. There's nothing suspicious. She's in the process of getting a divorce from her husband. It seems legit. They've actually filed the paperwork. So he starts to lean once again in the direction that she is truly innocent. Some of his suspicions assuaged. The way he was racking his brain on that bridge at the end of the last episode. So conflicted on whether he should trust his gut or his instincts or his feelings. Well, he's leaning back towards his heart or maybe his loins. And he sends a "you up?" or his version of the "you up" text. She tells him where she's staying, what hotel she's staying at. And Osman shows up at the exact same time, within moments of him arriving at the hotel. Osman has us all on lockdown, by the way, all the way back at the very beginning of the episode. He mentions that there are no women allowed in the hotel during this negotiation between these African delegates and this Chinese contingency. He doesn't want any distractions and, of course, doesn't want any spies showing up. And if he's suspicious of anyone, of course, the guy he was following earlier that day personally, who shook him off, seriously raised his suspicions. So Osman shows up at Samia's room. Samia answers the door, assuming that it's Martian, or Paul, as she knows him. And he starts to ask, all the way back at the end of episode 3, the conversation on the bridge, who did you go to the cinema with? She says it was a friend. He says, a friend or a lover? She says, okay, fine, a lover. Who cares? You're not here working for my husband. And there's some dialogue that's not translated here, but Martian is making some shocking realizations here. First of all, he may have endangered her because this character who's been following him around is not CIA. Second of all, he's somebody. I'm not sure if he makes his identity clear in this moment. I think it's when he's inside the room with her, so he would not have heard that he is a Sudanese agent, but he knows something is up. Why is she in close contact with this guy? He's probably assuming that she is manipulating him, but she seems to be pretty honest about what's going on in her conversation in the hallway, which of course he is listening in on, but of course she also knows that he's there. So is she being selective about what she says? Speaking of racking his brain, he is racking his brain as he exits the hotel moments later. Osman gets violent with her. I think this makes her look innocent because she still does not understand how risky her relationship with the Paul character is to both of them. And I don't think she sees this fully. And I'm sure he's thinking, oh, she's playing me. She's an agent of some kind. But then why would she have invited him to the hotel? Very fishy if she was trying to hide that from him. I honestly think that it feels like she is out of her depth here. She does eventually mention his name and say that he's an English teacher. Osman, of course, does not believe this at all, but now has a name to track down. That name is going to be a dead name, which is then going to put Martian in his crosshairs yet again and potentially endanger her life. If Osman and the powers that be think that he is an agent trying to derail this potential collaboration with the Chinese, she's going to be in trouble. And maybe that is the cataclysm that we are seeing the seeds of it here that are all going to pay off in these subsequent episodes. And in the very final moment of the episode, we are back in that framing device, back with him in the hospital. And this agent who's questioning him asks, why didn't you stop at that point? And he said, because he was falling. And when you're falling, sometimes you fall for so long, you think you're flying until you hit the ground. So he is going to hit the ground really hard. And the details of that are still not clear at all. All right, let me get into my conversation with Sona right after this short break. Happy birthday, Sona.
Oh, thank you so much for remembering. I'll take all the good energy, all the good karma I can get.
That's true. We all need it. We all need it nowadays. Was there anything you've watched recently that you wanted to shout out on the podcast?
Generally speaking, I just live in my reality show life, except when there's a show we're talking about. I have not watched a certain show yet, but I'm excited to do it. There's a new dark comedy series with Ray Romano and Lisa Kudrow. Have you seen that?
I've heard negative reviews for it. Just
warning you. No. I was looking forward to watching it this weekend, but maybe I'll reconsider then. It looks good to me.
You can't always go by the reviews, so especially with that type of show. But it's from the folks who did Dead to Me, which I think you really liked, right?
Yeah, loved.
So maybe it's up your alley. You should definitely give it a shot.
I will report back if I watch it.
I plan to watch it. Maybe you'll watch this as well. I plan to watch Carry On. Have you seen the trailer for this?
I don't think so.
So this actually stars Taron Egerton and Jason Bateman as the villain, by the way. And he's a junior TSA agent. Somehow he is blackmailed into allowing a carry-on onto a plane by Jason Bateman. And he's worried that it could have something really disastrous on board. So he's trying to comply and yet not, trying to work both sides.
That sounds interesting. Is it a drama or is it a comedy?
The reviews have been saying that it is a thriller, not comedic. It's a fun thriller. And by the way, just to give you a flavor of this is directed by Jean Colette Serra, who has directed many, tying back to a conversation we had last week. He's directed many of your favorite Liam Neeson action movies.
Fantastic. Sign me up.
And also Orphan, which I think you like as well. So anyway, that's kind of the vibe. And he makes these type of trashy but entertaining, usually action films, sometimes thrillers. And I've heard that this is exactly like that. So it's like, it takes itself very seriously, but you can just laugh at it in a knowing way. I heard that it's very much a solid film that you can enjoy throughout and does take itself seriously enough where there are stakes. And by the way, that is a good end of night watch for me for sure.
It sounds fantastic. I want to check it out myself.
I will probably review it when I speak with Darren in a couple days on the Day of the Jackal finale, which we just saw. And a little spoiler for my reaction, I was pretty disappointed with this, although I think that people are going to love it, but I might be an outlier in this particular case. But I'll have my review of Carry On, which I have not yet watched, and my review of the finale of the Jackal as well in the next episode. All right, I'm going to hit some plot beats here, some questions, feel you out on this episode of television. First of all, the episode's called Quarterback Blitz, which I'm not sure what that means, because that usually means that everyone's coming at the quarterback, which is not the football maneuver that they are calling out earlier in the show. So I'm not sure what the title means here, other than that there is a lot of stuff coming at us, specifically at Martian in this particular episode. But when the episode kicks off, what did you think about this sequence? Samia turns out, she's not a spy. Maybe she is yet, but that's not what's revealed here. The fact that she was being trailed by Osman last week, he is not there because of her husband. Turns out that Samia is there as a subject matter expert to assist with these negotiations with the Chinese and the Sudanese, between the Chinese and Sudanese. And Osman is a member of some intelligence agency for the Sudanese. I never really thought about this. This is one thing I like about spy novels and spy TV shows and movies as well. You kind of learn something about the geopolitical situation around the world. And I know that the Sudan's been having this civil war, but I never thought about the fact that there is this element of them being what they call a triple threat, is that what they call them, where they have oil, they have gold, the curse of the what do they call that, the resource curse.
I don't think I've heard of that.
Basically the idea is that there are many places around the world, whether it be Venezuela or different parts of like Nigeria, for example, where you have a curse of having something that is incredibly valuable, whether it be diamonds or whether it be gold or whether it be oil. And on paper, that would be a great thing, but all these places are incredibly unstable, right? You could even throw Russia into that, which the vast majority of its money comes from energy as well. These places are not stable places, even though theoretically they should be utopian, right? They could basically pay their bills with one industry, but that's not the case oftentimes. And so it sounds like they've been cursed multiple times. And of course, on top of having gold and oil deposits, they also have access to the Suez Canal as well. So I never really thought about that, how the instability of civil war that's going on there could be an opportunity for these bigger players in the region. So that's what's being set up here. And the Chinese now are secretly joining this negotiation. What do you think about Samia being in the middle of this? Do you think there's something more nefarious there? What do you think her motivations are, what her agenda is?
Yeah, so this is one of the parts of a spy show where I wonder if I'm missing something, because I don't know if I'm supposed to take it at face value, or I somehow have missed something that I'm supposed to understand in order to get the other layers of this. I really don't know what to think, to be honest. Did you have a sense of it?
This is like her character in general, and I think this is intentional. You could read it innocently. This is an opportunity for her. They're probably paying her. It gets her out of the country. It has an opportunity to go to London, of course, where she wants to see her lover as well. So all those things are there. But you could imagine if she was an agent, she could be like a double agent here, and she could have some additional agenda, because we see later on that she's politically active. And it's strange that she would suddenly be just doing this for a payday. Maybe she is, right? I mean, everybody needs to do the best they can given her limited circumstances here, or limited opportunities, I should say. But you could read it that way. It could be more nefarious. But maybe we'll save more speculation to later on when he shows up at her hotel as to whether we read her as being innocent. Long story short, I think given her reaction at the end of the episode, and we could dig into that scene, which is a very important scene, she seems to be really caught off guard by things escalating, which makes me feel like she is kind of naive in this circumstance, I would say. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Yes, based on the hotel scene, yes.
Next thing I wanted to mention to you was I like when Martian shows up at Henry's office and he's chasing that mouse. And he goes on this digression about how most of the rats, which is true, by the way, the European rats, the ones that came from the UK, were much bigger than the ones in the US, the native rats we had here. And they basically took over the entire continent. So Sona, if you wonder where those giant rats come from New York, now you know.
And I do. Yes, I learned something new with that little segment, because I was not aware of that. Although you can see how it would happen. I didn't know it.
Now you do. He calls it out specifically. All those rats in New York came from here. It's not just New York. It's everywhere. It's the whole North America. I do like when he is chasing the mouse and Martian walks in and says, Mecca is that way, as if he caught him praying. So they're heading downstairs. They turn out there's been a little bit of this international incident. Some U.S. congressperson has insulted Belarus, and the Belarusians are showing up. Turns out that Henry has coordinated this whole entire thing. We find out later, but Henry and Martian are heading downstairs to listen in, just to listen in on this conversation, to just feel out, like we're just going to make some kind of scene and just feel out the audience. And they promise Richard Gere's character, Bosco, they're just going to listen. And he goes, and you're not going to say a word. And so I laughed out loud when Henry almost immediately starts to talk. And
immediately.
Richard Gere turns around and looks at him like, are you shitting me? And then Martian starts talking too. And he just turns to him like, what is going on? The next thing I wanted to mention to you or ask you about was so happy to see Daniela here. I think that's something that was the one thing I loved last week's episode, by the way. I've heard some people didn't like it that much, very much like last week's episode. But Daniela, no Daniela, and I definitely wanted to catch up with her. So we do get a lot of Daniela in this episode.
We do, and I liked it. Yes, this is a really interesting storyline.
So my next question to you, Sona, as I'm watching this, we see that she is with Naomi, who's basically become her
Handler.
handler. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And she's dropping her off at this university where she is pretending to be a seismologist. And obviously, as we know, she's trying to get into this, getting good with this Iranian scientist. I really liked the narration where Naomi's telling her that when you get inside that building, there's going to be three types of enemies you're going to encounter. One are going to be rivals, people who are trying to basically attain the same thing you're trying to attain. So there's going to be that competition, right? And they're going to undermine you so that they can take your position. The second one, very interesting, was friends, right? Because friends can be a distraction. They can be a tool sometimes, but they can also be a distraction. While you are minding your friendships, you are taking your eye off the ball potentially. And then the third one is predators. And of course, when they say that, we actually see that Reza is the predator that they're looking at, and we see him later actually play that out. Now, of course, I think there's something to be said for anybody in this circumstance, but I made me wonder, is this like what women have to deal with every time they're in some kind of a competitive social situation? Because there's that whole stereotype that women end up becoming contentious with each other. And of course, something that men normally don't have to deal with, which is an actual predatory behavior in general on the workplace. So did this resonate for you in your experiences just in general?
The thing about litigation is that it is inherently competitive in many ways, both with your opposing counsel and just the nature of litigation firms tends to be that you are somewhat in competition with each other. So I guess I've worked in that field for so long that it's just become the default that I'm used to. And at the same time, I mean, it can be very collaborative. Maybe this is a good example. I had to take a trip for a firm outing that we were having. We decided a few of us would get drinks beforehand. I am relatively new compared to the other people I was going out with. And one of them texted me, so and so asked if we could invite you. And she said, I know her. She's not a spy. And so it's like we're always thinking about whether we can trust other people because we want to be open with what we think and what we feel, but we don't want it turned around on us and, used and like you've exposed a weakness of some sort. I think women are always thinking on that level in the corporate world, in the legal world. I'm not sure about other fields. I would think and hope that other fields are more collaborative, but I don't know. I don't have experience there. It might be just as bad in a different way.
I've heard that it's extremely competitive in academia, so that makes perfect sense as well. And I've also worked mostly in large corporations, and I definitely have known people oftentimes are failing upwards, but they fail upwards because they are always putting themselves in the position that needs to be filled, and they don't have friends. Like, everything is completely transactional. Like, what can I get from this person? And since they're always just thinking about making that next move, it is they succeed at it, right? Because most people are too busy doing their jobs to worry as much about just focusing on climbing the corporate ladder. But the whole predator thing made me think about how that is something. Once again, there's like that whole saying that men worry that women will laugh at them, women are afraid that men will kill them. Which, of course, is something that men traditionally do not have to worry about, although women can be predators as well. It's just much less frequent, of course. And, I think about that all the time. Like, women just have to deal with this predatory aspect in a career. But then, of course, it made me think about Daniela as a spy who you have to assume, and this is something that she maybe is wrestling with here in this episode, that is going to have to be part of her job to some extent, right? Like, that is accepting that and maybe even using it.
You can use it to your advantage. I'm not saying anything novel here. It's difficult for women because you need to be, at least in certain fields that I've been involved with, I think it helps to be conventionally attractive, but you can't be too conventionally attractive.
Right.
And it helps to be friendly, but you don't want to be too friendly.
Too friendly.
I mean, you're
exactly.
constantly walking a line of trying to ingratiate yourself with people that have power and control in a way that's going to benefit you, but not blow up in your face. And it is a little bit nerve-wracking, stressful.
And we'll get to it in a few minutes, but we'll talk about how you think she navigated this whole thing.
Yeah, I have questions.
Yeah, me too. So Poppy shows up again. I've already said this in the previous recap. I think she has great chemistry with Fassbender, this actress. And
Terrific. Yes, terrific.
I liked all these interactions. Like, it's one of those things where they just make little inside jokes with each other, and I chuckle along. It's like as if you know them as people, and they seem really comfortable around each other. This is really great casting here.
I agree.
I like the way he apologizes to her and says, look, we're just both making this up as we go along, which I empathize with strongly, right? As a parent, there is all this brainwashing in social media specifically, but across the board, that you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. And it's just like, look, we're all just making this up as we go along. He, of course, disappeared for most of her childhood. So that's a much more egregious neglect on his part. But she offers a little olive branch that, hey, if we do a little shopping therapy to the local mall, that will help amend things, which of course he plays along with. Later on, when he says, well, I have about an hour before he has to go do something else. So she goes, well, it'll cost twice as much for half the time.
Right.
A lot of fun. What do you think about shopping therapy versus therapy? By the way, when I like how her reaction, she practically takes a spit take when she finds out that he's taking doing therapy, which of course is imposed on him. I don't think he would choose to do that.
I was about to say his presentation of it was a little bit different than what the reality is. But I like that he knew it would impress his daughter, and so that's why he said it that way. I think some retail therapy can be helpful, but it doesn't substitute for actual therapy.
Yes.
Probably are not going to actually resolve any deep-seated issues by buying a nice handbag, but it will make you, at least temporarily, happy.
And it will force him to be thinking about her for at least that period of time. Osman shows up and is trailing them, and he's smart enough to know, as a matter of fact, he tells his daughter, there's someone trailing us right now. I'm pretty sure he thinks he's a CIA operative, because he seems to be really shocked when Osman turns up later on, where he does. But I did like him and his daughter having this little fun being in cahoots, which of course is always fun for parents to, you're on the same page basically together. So it was very sweet. And at the same time, I was thinking back in my mind, like, there's going to be repercussions to this, because Osman is not the most chill guy in the world.
Boy, were there. Yikes.
And then, of course, after that, we see Martian and Dr. Blake having this conversation once again, whenever they're together in that interrogation room, doing their therapy, quote unquote, which is being recorded, so not private at all, which I think is not conducive to therapy when you know that all these conversations are going to be reviewed by somebody else later on.
I agree.
First question to you, Sona, is Dr. Blake's confession about her sexual history appropriate in this context?
No, it is not. It is not.
Then again, she has just asked him, right?
Well, therapy isn't really supposed to be a two-way street in that manner. But I do appreciate that she's trying to gain his trust by sharing these things about herself. But it is very unconventional. Usually therapists try and be just like a blank canvas where they tell you very little about themselves.
I mean, I assume that's the case. I've not been in therapy myself. And I even noted that this seems inappropriate. Obviously, she's giving him the power, which of course is what he's always doing. He's always trying to turn the tables. So whether this is true or not, it may be true, may not be true, that she is basically giving him what he's asking for. And then that is like upping the ante. Now he needs to respond to her question, right?
Right, which he does, but not honestly. So
he lies. Exactly. He lies twice. He lies about the last time he had sex. He does tell the truth, a big truth. He confesses to being in love with her.
Yes, but just talking about this technique as a therapist, maybe it's building blocks and she's building trust, but the immediate exchange of information, it didn't entirely pay off for her. But yes.
But once again, what kind of therapy is this? That's why I put quotes around it, because therapy is not normally recorded, and the therapist doesn't normally have an agenda, to elicit an answer that can be reviewed later by a group of people in the room.
Very true.
Perhaps she is willing to play this game of chess in the open since they all know the game.
Right. Maybe she's lying too. We don't know.
Yeah, exactly. We don't know. She could be hooking up that night. Who knows?
She might have a husband for all we know. Still.
Exactly. This might all be made up. And this is all a game of chicken with the two of them. And of course, the other lie he tells is how he cut his hand, which I like this idea that wounds heal, that she mentions that wounds heal, and then they become stories. You think about a psychic wound, or you think about just an experience you have that might be hurtful, and how that just becomes part of your character over time. But of course, he lies about that too. I love that says that he got it from an avocado pit. I don't think I've ever cut my hand that deeply hitting an avocado, which apparently turns out to be slitting someone's throat, I think.
Well, it does. But you know that technique. Have you seen? I am not one on the avocado train, first of all. I mean, I do like a nice bowl of guacamole, but that's it. But have you seen that technique of like you just hit the pit so hard with a chef's knife that if you do it properly, it makes it very easy to remove. But if you miss, you have slashed into your hand.
Oh, I have not seen that technique. So maybe that's
I'll
exactly what he
try
was talking
and
about.
find a clip to send you. Yeah, it's
I'll find the
really,
TikTok.
it makes me nervous to even watch it. So it is in a way, it's a believable story.
I guess that's why he used it as cover. It is a pretty serious cut he has there.
It is.
Meanwhile, back with Danny, we see that she has impressed Reza when he is listening to her speak on her specialty, which is all practiced, apparently, like all rehearsed, I should say. She does not actually know anything about this. And to the point where he says, why don't you come with me tonight to this meeting, like 25 top experts in your field? And of course, this is great on one hand that she has impressed him, but terrifying as well. She lets a battery in her phone run out. Spy 101, by the way. Charge that phone.
I mean, at least have a portable charger that
Exactly.
you can throw in your purse. Yeah.
But of course, all this is for him to make a move on her. She gets in the car with him. She has 25 pages, by the way, of this dissertation to memorize. She's in an hour to do it. Not great.
I like the interaction between her and her handler also here, where, she comes home and finds her in the apartment. And so she's startled by that. And then like, how many pages can you memorize? 25 an hour? No, 25.
Total.
All of it, I thought was really nicely done.
She seems like she's a little bit over her head in a few ways. But one of them I find very funny, the conversation with Naomi, where she tells her, I have the spa appointment. She goes, well, I can't make it right now. Well, this is your only opportunity. So she's like, okay. She goes running back to her apartment. And then she walks in and like you said, she's surprised. And she's like, how did you get into my apartment? And she's just like, don't ask me stupid questions anymore, which is true. It's like these people definitely know how to get into your apartment. That's like the first thing they probably learn. But of course, we go back to the car situation. He's making a move on her. What do you think about this whole diffusion? She gets very uncomfortable. Then she comes up with this story, which may be legitimate to some extent anyway, that she has this memory of her father. And of course, that's a good way to diffuse the situation. Of course, this person wants to be your lover. And now you start saying, well, you remind me so much of my dad. It's like, oh, okay. I don't know if that's what I want. So of course, that's her intention. And it seems like it might be working. She's trying to appeal to his paternalistic instincts. But then he's like, well, why don't I just leave you here? Someone else will do the opening statement.
I mean, it pulled over on the side of the road.
Yeah, she didn't even take him. He didn't even take her back.
Okay, get out. Yeah.
But that's what I was going to ask about, because the episode ends and she smirks. And I'm thinking like, does she think this is some kind of a win?
Yeah, this was really strange to me. And I actually was watching this episode with my husband. We had this conversation because he's been kind of in and out of watching this with me. And I was explaining how she needs to ingratiate herself with him. And then we were talking about how it is a very established method of spycraft that we saw a lot in the Americans, of like honey trapping someone or whatever it's called, right? Honey pot, honey trap. I don't know. Yeah. But, basically you make it romantic and then you gain that leverage over them by getting their romantic feelings involved. And so when I heard what she was trying to accomplish before this scene, I thought, well, she's going to end up flirting with him and maybe sleeping with him. Right. So I thought like, okay, she's trying to set this into motion and maybe she's playing hard to get because she's not ready to go there yet. She doesn't want to make it too easy for him. Like maybe she's going to use it as leverage about like how badly she wants to be chosen for this position in Iran and like all of it. Even the father stuff I didn't question. And I think it may be true based on her conversation with her mom later. But when he pulled over on the side of the road, I thought, well, this blew up in her face. Right. And then the little smile, I didn't understand what the win was there for her. Right. My husband's theory was that she actually was thinking of a nice memory of her father. And that's why she smiled. But I didn't get that. To me, it was about her kind of mission and thinking that she had made a step towards accomplishing it. But I didn't see it that way. Yeah, I was confused by this also. And I had both interpretations to some extent. I did think, like your husband said, there's a version of it where she did have a memory of him. And of course, it did trigger something because she calls her mom that night about her dad and she gets emotional about it as well.
So there might be that aspect to it, but I do think there's something a lot more going on there. When I was taking notes here for this conversation, I started to play out a scenario, maybe to the all the things you just mentioned. If they hooked up right away, then that's not going to help her get to Iran because he'll be like done with that potentially, and maybe doesn't want her around because it could be
Right.
messy, right?
Yes.
But if he's interested, well, then now that's some leverage she has. And then she could keep him on the hook to some extent. So maybe in her mind, she's thinking like, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to slow play this, like really lean into the paternalistic thing, but then over time, allow it to become romantic. And then that will keep him on the hook. So I'm thinking maybe she has a plan and she's hatching it at this moment. That's my guess that, that she's thinking like, oh, he is interested. I can use this, right? Although at that moment, when he doesn't even drive her home, he's just like, get out of the car. I'm like, I think
Crazy.
you got a long climb back at this point.
Yeah, it's a long road. Yeah.
And you already mentioned it later that night. She has a conversation with her mom. How did you read that this is triggering the emotion in her? Do you think this is a bad agent, that she's a bad agent because she's already allowing these things to feed into her emotions? Or do you think the show is saying that that is part of the job, right? That you need to use your history to be a believable agent. So, and now she's just starting to experience that.
I thought it was the latter. I think that.
I think that. Oh, I forgot to mention this, that the ruse earlier on where they were reaching out to the Belarus characters and Henry has intentionally got contentious in the conversation and Martian is looking, checking to see if there's anybody who seems to have a different agenda there. And they spot this particular guy. And I was, even at the time, I was just like saying, is this guy just checking him out? Like, what's going on here? But he did eventually run into him. He understands Russian. And he overheard him say that he wanted to go check out some club, some kind of S&M club that we see later on. And he does indeed take him to that club. And during their interactions there, he mentions to him, this is a really weird metaphor they coming up with. Last time I was around here,
Yes.
I lost my bike. And, sometimes
Yes.
you'll just pay a lot more money than something seems to be worth. And all, of course, this is to say that they want Coyote back. The agent seems to understand and then takes his phone number. We see him activate a burner phone as soon as he hands him the number. He goes back to the office and they have this case eventually we see where they have all these burner phones inside of them. So I guess they're all attached to different assets that are out there. And if any one of these people rings, it's like, I don't know if they like put a sticky note on the back or whatever, but it's like, call this guy up because it's...
It's from when we were little, that little office memo pad while you were out.
Exactly. If this phone rings, call this person.
Belarus called at 6:40 p.m.
Just put Coyote on there. And this is also when we find out, by the way, after Bosco has left the conversation, that Henry said, well, that all paid off, or hopefully this all pays off, because apparently Henry's been coordinating this whole thing. This congressperson who said this thing about Belarus also had his son had been caught with a large amount of cocaine at an airport. So they basically used that as leverage to get the congressperson to make this public statement. Very convoluted process here.
Agree.
I did like in this whole interaction, Bosco is telling Henry that he needs to get more hobbies. And he has these painted army soldiers, like Revolutionary War soldiers. I'm like, man, that's your hobby? That's the best he could do for hobbies. What's going to be your retirement hobby, Sona? Are you going to be painting models? What are you going to be doing?
I love a good craft. I could just go all in on, do you know what a Cricut machine is?
No, I don't know that.
It's this paper crafting machine. We have friends that have them and use them. You can just make all sorts of paper crafts with them. And I actually have one, but I've never had the time to learn how to use it. So I could see myself going all in on cricketing.
It would be a little harder to illustrate in this particular scene, though.
He's printing 3D snowflakes.
Let me show you what I have in my pocket right now. Oh, I forgot to mention that in the midst of all this, Martian finds out, had this junior analyst investigating Sammy, and her story checks out. He doesn't see any gaps in her history. Nothing seems suspicious. There is an actual divorce decree in place right now. So her and her husband are in the process of getting divorced. And then that triggers, to some extent, him reaching out to her again. And then we have to talk about the whole final sequence there when he arrives at the hotel once she tells him where she's staying. But before then, we see that flashback to Ethiopia. So what do you think about this whole sequence here? Of course, we see it ends with the off screen it happens, but the whole avocado to his hand situation, which, ends up with one of the military guys dead during they made their escape. Yes. Oh, I love the escape over the rooftop that drone shot or whatever it was. They're like these tiny little specks are running across that rooftop. I thought it was a pretty amazing shot.
Yeah, I mean, this was all very dramatic. I guess it is support for why their bond is so intense
True.
to have gone through something like this together. I mean, I was kind of surprised. Like their relationship with each other did not read to me as like we've been in life and death situations
Right.
together. It just didn't come across. But I mean, it explains why the feelings would be so intense. It was interesting to watch, exciting to watch.
Do you think she should have ever gotten suspicious of him at any point?
Oh my God, absolutely.
Like he seems way too adept at hiding her. And
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like he's an
Yes.
English professor. Like, the fact that you run down the street and you escape, or you're like, he's wary enough to keep an eye out and be like, you got to get down right now. Come on, let's go. And then whatever, he's got good cardio. So they go for a long run and they escape. Fine. But he's like in Jason Bourne mode immediately, right? Like, shuffling her behind corners and locking her behind doors and disappearing. There's this one really cool shot where he disappears into like the shadow, and they come in, and they check in really quick, and they step out, and then he emerges from the shadow. It's like very cool. Like, this is not the usual Joe Schmo who's, just running for his life.
Even if she doesn't explicitly know, on some level she knows. He acts pretty freaking weird for a normal English
Right.
professor guy. So, and she doesn't seem stupid.
Right.
So, on some level, if not literally, she knows subconsciously. I mean, even when he leaves her, this is like such a deep love. And when
Right.
he says he's leaving, she's kind of, knew this day would come. None of it makes sense otherwise.
Yeah, she has to understand something about him.
And it, gets back to that idea of like, don't ask questions you don't want to know the answers to.
It,
She just is going along with it.
exactly. But then it makes me wonder if she has to assume there's something shady going on. And there was finally, in all their interactions, even in the flashback, we've only had that one or two interactions at the end of last week's episode where she's like, what the hell's going on? Or even their text messages being like, what are you just ghosted me after you showed up at the hotel and just walked away in the middle of the night? So she's finally being like, what the hell's going on here? But still, like you said, there's a lot of other shadiness going on even before then. And given all that, she then invites him to the hotel. You could read this potentially as she's intentionally trying to make a scene, trying to manipulate Osman, for example. There's ways where you can think she's a double agent. And, correct me if you disagree with any of this, but when she shows up at the door in this hotel where, it's been made very clear that they cannot have guests, and Osman is chaperoning all these folks, he tells all the guys, no women are allowed in the hotel, period. So, but if they can't have company, so, of course, that extends to her as well. Instead, we see that she has invited him there. But more importantly, she goes to answer the door. She really seems surprised that it's Osman and not the Fassbender.
Yes, agree.
And then, of course, things get really out of control. It's very interesting, though. There's some other agenda she has that she's still protecting to some extent. I don't think it's nefarious necessarily, but there's something else going on here with her. She's very careful about how she answers Osman's questions because she knows that he's there, that Martian is there listening. So what did you think about this whole scene? I can't get a clean read on it.
I mean, it seems like obviously she's going with the cover story, right? Whether she truly believes it or not, she's going to go with the cover story. And she does seem like she is genuinely fearful to me.
Yeah.
But yes, at the same time, I mean, we don't know. She caught a glance of him for a second, but she doesn't know that he can know if he can hear her, or maybe he left, right? I mean, there's a lot that is not certain about this.
Yeah, she might have assumed he just ducked out, but
because I think they're kind of like deeper into the room at a certain point, aren't they?
Yeah, when she starts telling him specific details inside. As a matter of fact, once they went into the room together, he disappears. Right, he like exits the hotel. We actually see the ugliest part of that confrontation when we cut back to Martian. He's already outside of the hotel, like basically passing the guards outside.
Yeah. So to me, the assumption would be when she's saying the cover story and all of it's genuine, that she really is fearful, and she thinks that these are the answers she should give. And I guess she doesn't really necessarily know any other answers to give.
Even if she suspects something, she wouldn't know what to say. I assume you're right. What do you think the fallout of this is going to be? Because you have to assume he's going to start investigating, but this identity has been completely burned, right? He still has that driver's license. We saw him looking at it before. This Paul character that he was playing when he was in Ethiopia, but they have basically eradicated this person's history. The fact that this person doesn't exist when they start to do their investigation is going to be incredibly suspicious.
You would think.
Exactly. I feel like this is going to be the beginning of this unraveling that's going to happen because they're going to immediately assume the worst because they, of course, are going to think it's pertaining to their particular agenda, right?
Right.
We obviously have not seen any of this fallout, but do you have any kind of inclination as to what this cataclysm is, this particular disaster that's occurred, where he is at the beginning of the episode and then again at the end, he has this, swelling under his eye. He's in a gurney, in a hospital gown or on a gurney. He's been injured badly. Do you have any feeling what the cause of this might be?
No, I really have no sense of that. I'm trying to remember. Did we see hospital scenes with him before
It was
this episode?
It was the final moment of last week's episode, only in episode
Right.
3. Someone's questioning him, same person, this female voice we hear here, we don't know
Right.
who it is, with a British accent, who questions him in this week's episode. And in last week's episode, very reminiscent, actually, this is kind of redundant to some extent. In last week's episode, they asked him, why didn't you say that you were with her at the time? And he basically says, I should have ended it then. And so we know it has something to do with Sammy, something somehow related to that, the relationship. And that's about all we heard last week. And then this week we hear that he is saying that he was falling. And sometimes when you're falling, you fall for so long, you convince yourself that you're
Mm-hmm.
flying until you hit the ground. He's falling right now. But
Right.
it once again definitely seems like it is somehow related to the relationship with Sammy. At first, it seemed like the way I read it in the previous conversation we had about this, I was assuming that maybe she is a double agent or something. But now at this point, I'm thinking,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that she is like an agent who's going to be behind some kind of terrorist attack or something. I actually think what probably is happening is that his misread of things and him continuing this relationship is going to inadvertently lead to something really terrible happen, which is even more tragic to some extent, right? Rather than like having something.
Truly, yes.
If this was all an accidental, like if there's a big misunderstanding as to what his role it is on all of this,
Right.
and Osman is just really worried about this particular meeting and overreacts and overreads things, then Sammy and him can both be terribly injured at some point, and for the wrong thing, basically. Like he is a
Right.
spy, but he's not spying on them, and he just doesn't realize it.
Right.
So yeah, that's my guess. Although we have had very few clues as to what that might eventually be.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So how did you like this? How did it compare to the first 3 episodes? Are you more interested, less interested?
I'm continuing to enjoy this. I think I missed seeing the brother-in-law character whose name I can't remember at the
Yeah.
moment.
I don't
But
remember
I
his name
did
either,
miss.
actually.
I like that storyline as well. So, and I'm sure they will return to it. I did miss seeing that, but I do like, I think in exchange, we got the Daniela storyline and I did
Right.
enjoy
Mm-hmm.
that. So, I feel like things are moving along. I'm still enjoying it. How about you?
Yeah, no, I liked it very much. I liked having the Daniela character come back in. I have heard some people complain that it's what you were describing, that because they're like kind of shuffling the deck where we're paying a little bit attention to this story, we're spending a little bit of time now, like Daniela's back in the mix, but now the Project Felix or whatever that is not the focus this week. People have complained about that. I actually like this. I assume that they are this is world building, right? Different characters will be the focus at different times and they'll pop into the storyline and out. I actually don't want to see 8 different storylines where they all get 3 or 4 minutes per episode telling me what's important at that time. And I like this. So basically, long story short, is there has been some negative reviews around the show. And I think that the things that are being written up in negative ways, I actually like this fact. I guess it's not as propulsive as you would hope to see, but this is a long season, right? Like for me, I think like a 10 episode season, which is what we have here, is pretty long time. If it was going to be a very straightforward, the stakes are clearly defined at episode 1, and then you're waiting for the big event to occur in the final episode. 10 episodes is a long time to wait. So they kind of feel, bloated. Like I saw The Night Agent, which we discussed briefly. Season 2 of that is coming in January, by the way, just yet another spy show. So many spy shows. That was exactly how I felt with that. Riveting first episode. Everything gets resolved perfectly, buttoned up perfectly, no loose ends in the final episode. So people found that really satisfying. And then like 3 or 4 episodes where people are hiding out and in car chases. I'm like, I don't need to see 4 episodes of car chases. I got it. So I prefer to have this. And for me, investing in all these additional stories is long-term. If you want to watch this show, like Slow Horses, for example, which has been on for 4 years. Now the 5th season is about to come out. I prefer seeing them investing long-term. So yeah, I like it. I like it.
I'm with you. I agree.
No trailers again because we're watching on Paramount Plus. So, and I did not even bother to try to track down if there was a Showtime trailer for next week. But at this point, no trailer. Anybody who's going to listen to this and watch this on Sunday night on Showtime, you probably will see scenes from
Right.
next week because they do normally show scenes. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
All right, Sona, thank you again for the conversation.
Thank you.
And we'll talk soon. We'll talk again next week when the next episode drops.
Sounds good. Talk to you soon.
All right, thanks.